In the last hours of the Third Reich, not only the Nazi leaders faced their destiny among ruins and fire, along with them, their wives carried terrible decisions. Some died by poisoning their children, others were consumed by illness, many survived only to drag the shame of the surname. This is the brutal account of those women trapped between fanaticism, power, and defeat. Magda Goebbels, the mother of the Reich and the tragedy of the bunker. In the damp basements of the Führer bunker, when the Soviet artillery made the walls of the Chancellery tremble, a woman walked with her eyes fixed on the ground and 6 children around her. Magda Goebbels was not only the wife of the Minister of Propaganda, she was the embodiment of the Aryan mother, the woman who had been turned into a symbol by Hitler himself. And in those final hours, she carried with her the most terrible decision, that which would turn her into the protagonist of one of the most atrocious scenes in history. She was born on the 11th of November of 1901 in Berlin in a bourgeois family of modest aspirations. Her childhood was marked by instability. Her parents separated early, and her mother, August Behrendt, remarried, this time to a Jewish industrialist, Richard Friedländer. With him, Magda lived part of her childhood, and although in adulthood she would deny it or try to erase it, that relationship shaped an uncomfortable aspect of her biography. The future Aryan mother of the Third Reich had grown up with a Jewish stepfather. That, in the context of Nazi Germany, was a secret that had to be buried under propaganda. It was in those years of crisis of the Weimar Republic when she met Joseph Goebbels. The encounter was not by chance. Magda had drawn near to the NSDAP and to Hitler, fascinated by the messianic energy radiated by the movement. Joseph, the young rising minister of propaganda, was dazzled by her blonde beauty and her distinguished air. They married in December of 1931 with Hitler as the guest of honor. The marriage was a political event. The union between the refined bourgeois woman and the incendiary agitator was transformed into a showcase for the new regime. Magda assumed a symbolic role immediately. In the 1930s, she was presented as the First Lady of the Reich, even eclipsing Eva Braun, who remained hidden in the shadows. She appeared in parades, inaugurations, official acts, and above all as the exemplary mother of 6 blonde children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. The family image of the Goebbels was exploited by propaganda as an example of the ideal Aryan family. Hitler, single and without descendants, found in Magda and her children the living embodiment of that which he preached in his speeches. But behind the facade of happiness there were permanent tensions. Joseph was an unfaithful husband, addicted to lovers, secretaries, actresses, and singers paraded through his life, while Magda endured in silence. On several occasions she threatened to divorce, and even went so far as to draft letters of separation. However, Hitler intervened each time. For the Führer, the Goebbels were not just a couple, they were an emblem of the Reich. The marital stability of Magda was in reality a political obligation. She understood it and accepted the sacrifice. She knew that her role was not that of betrayed wife, but that of symbolic mother of the nation. Magda lived with an aura of elegance and solemnity. She was not seen in frivolities or public scandals. She embodied the image of the cultured, pious, serene woman. For many Germans, she was an almost maternal figure, close to myth. That perception gave her a privileged place next to the Führer. In intimacy, Hitler spoke with her, confided in her, treated her with a respect that few women received. Magda became the depository of confidences, the hostess of private dinners, a discreet but essential symbol. The war disrupted that image. The Allied bombings destroyed Berlin, the fronts collapsed one after another, and the Reich that Hitler had promised eternal crumbled. Magda remained in the center of power, participating in receptions, sending her children to safe shelters, trying to maintain the facade of normality. But by the year 1944, her gaze was already different. She had accepted that there was no future, that Germany would not survive defeat. In private letters, she wrote that she could not imagine her children growing up in a world without National Socialism. That idea began to incubate what would be the most terrible decision of her life. In April of 1945, when the Red Army surrounded Berlin and Hitler locked himself in the Führer bunker, Magda descended into that underground refuge with Joseph and their 6 children. The contrast was brutal. In the narrow and damp hallways, illuminated by weak light bulbs, the leaders played at prolonging the fiction of power while above the city burned under Soviet artillery. Eva Braun organized improvised dinners, smiling as if life went on. Magda, on the other hand, walked in silence, with her gaze fixed, laden with a gloomy determination. There she wrote letters to relatives and friends. In them she explained that her children could not survive the world that was to come. She described them as too pure to be raised in an occupied Germany, humiliated, dominated by the enemy. She repeated the idea that the defeat was not only military but the end of civilization. In her mind, killing her children was an act of fidelity to the Reich and to Hitler, a necessary sacrifice. The little ones, meanwhile, played in the corridors, unaware of what was approaching. Helga, the eldest, 12 years old, began to sense something. She looked suspiciously at the grave gestures of the adults, asking insistently. On the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide alongside Eva Braun. The next day, Magda carried out her decision. With the help of the doctor Ludwig Stumpfegger and an assistant of the SS, she sedated the children with sleeping pills. Then, one by one, they inserted cyanide capsules into their mouths. Some later accounts say that Helga tried to resist, that she refused to take the pill and was held by force. Her face would have shown signs of struggle. The silence that followed was thick, unbearable. 6 small bodies lay lined up in their beds as if they were sleeping. Minutes later, Magda and Joseph went up to the garden of the Chancellery. There, among the bomb craters, they decided to accompany Hitler in death. They took cyanide together. Some witnesses maintain that Joseph was also finished off with a gunshot to ensure his end. Their bodies were sprayed with gasoline and set on fire, but barely burned partially. The Soviets would find the remains days later, charred, confused among rubble and ashes. Magda's act resonated among all the survivors of the bunker. It was not seen as an outburst of desperation, but as a ritual, the final offering to the dying Reich. While Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl signed the surrender days later, while Karl Dönitz tried to govern the remains of a non-existent state, the figure of Magda Goebbels remained marked as the most brutal epilogue of National Socialism. The mother who had been presented as Aryan model had killed her 6 children in the name of Hitler. Magda Goebbels became a symbol of total destruction. Her end cannot be separated from the collapse of the Reich. She and Joseph were the last guardians of a cult that was extinguishing. In the ruins of Berlin, among corpses, rubble and flames, her epitaph was written, "The mother of the Reich who killed her children so that they would not exist in a world without Nazism." Gerda Bormann, the wife in the shadow of the Secretary of the Reich. In the silence of South Tyrol, surrounded by snow-covered mountains and a future reduced to ashes, Gerda Bormann was slowly agonizing in a hospital bed. She was barely 36 years old, and cancer had already devoured her body. Her husband, Martin Bormann, still remained alongside Hitler in Berlin, while she, far from the clamor of bombs, consumed herself in the darkness of an inevitable defeat. It was not a quick nor spectacular death, but the painful fading of the woman who had embodied the most silent fidelity of the regime. Gerda Buch was born in a home where devotion to National Socialism went beyond politics. It was a faith that shaped every gesture, every word, every decision. Her father, Walter Buch, presided over the party tribunal, an organism that not only safeguarded internal discipline of the NSDAP, but punished severely those who deviated from the Hitlerian dogma. She therefore grew up under a roof where the concept of obedience was ingrained in the blood. Unlike other wives of hierarchs who had been educated in the frivolity of salons, Gerda absorbed from childhood the austere, dogmatic and rigid spirit of National Socialist orthodoxy. That upbringing left indelible marks. She was always described as a quiet, devoted woman with a withdrawn character, almost shy in public, but unyielding in her convictions. In 1929, she married Martin Bormann, the man who would become the shadow of Hitler, his personal secretary and one of the most influential figures of the Third Reich. The bond between them was functional from the beginning. Martin saw in Gerda not only the daughter of a powerful man within the party, but also a companion who shared the absolute faith in the destiny of National Socialism. For Gerda, Bormann represented the strength she never had, the ability to impose himself in a brutal world that she accepted but did not know how to master. Together, they had 10 children, whom they raised within an environment marked by the cult of the Führer and absolute loyalty to the Reich. The marital relationship, however, was far from idyllic. Martin Bormann was constantly and scandalously unfaithful. His lovers were numerous, and he boasted of his power to seduce and discard women at will. Gerda knew it and tolerated it, convinced that her husband's mission was above private morality. That resignation turned her into an even darker figure, a woman aware of her place, incapable of rebelling, sustained only by the faith that everything was part of a higher mission. Hitler's inner circle saw her as a discreet wife without brilliance, overshadowed by the harshness and iron will of her husband. But that discretion hid an absolute fanaticism, a fidelity that would lead her to accept her destiny with tragic passivity. During the years of glory of the Reich, Gerda enjoyed privileges and comforts. She lived in residences near the Berghof, shared ceremonies with the wives of the hierarchs, and was received with deference by Hitler, who treated her with distant courtesy. Nevertheless, she never reached the visibility of Magda Goebbels nor the theatricality of Emmy Göring. Her role was to support, raise children, and maintain the facade of a large family that the Führer so liked to show as a symbol of Aryan fertility. The war advanced, her children grew, and the world around her slowly collapsed. In 1945, when the Reich was nothing more than smoking ruins and Berlin burned under Soviet projectiles, Gerda undertook a path that turned into her own condemnation. When Hitler locked himself in the Chancellery bunker, Martin Bormann remained by his side, acting as an implacable secretary until the end. Gerda, on the other hand, made the decision to flee south with a group of children and relatives. The journey was an odyssey of hunger, fear, and confusion. They crossed blocked roads, desolate fields, towns devastated by bombings. The caravan of women and children survived looting and gunfire until they reached South Tyrol in the Italian Alps, where there still existed a remnant of Nazi control. There they settled in a small valley near Bolzano, believing they had found a refuge far from the enemy's gaze. But the apparent safety hid a personal drama. Gerda had been ill for some time, and the pains became unbearable. Her sister, who accompanied her, later recounted that the physical suffering was constant and visible. The normally quiet woman could no longer conceal her groans. An Italian doctor consulted urgently, diagnosed her with advanced ovarian cancer. She needed immediate surgery, but the time of hospitals and medicine had vanished along with the Reich. The war had reduced the possibilities to almost nothing, despite everything the British found her. An officer, accompanied by intelligence agents, knocked at her door. Gerda thought the worst, that they would take her to a concentration camp or that her children would be taken away. The officer, surprised by the fragility of the woman before him, reassured her she was not in danger. They transferred her to a hospital for prisoners in Merano, where she was finally operated on. The surgery was useless. The illness was too widespread. Gerda understood it and resigned herself. In the midst of the disintegration of the Reich, she sought in religion a last consolation and asked to convert to Catholicism. That conversion, carried out in a cold hospital room, was her way of bringing order to chaos, of surrendering to a certainty older than Nazism when nothing remained of the promises of the millennial Reich. The following days were a slow descent into death. She could barely speak, and her sister recounted that sometimes she murmured the names of her children. The British, who guarded her, described her as an educated, serene woman, who accepted her destiny without resistance. On the 23rd of March of 1946, before turning 37 years old, Gerda Bormann exhaled her last breath in that hospital bed. She died without seeing the corpse of her husband, whose fate was still the subject of rumors, and leaving behind nothing more than some letters found in Berlin, written between 1943 and 1945, in which she appeared as a woman much more devoted and fanatical than her contemporaries believed. Her end did not have the spectacular nature of Magda Goebbels' suicide nor the political resonance of the scandal surrounding Emmy Göring. It was an end in a muted tone marked by illness, fear, and blind faith. A woman raised to obey, who accepted infidelities, fanaticism, and in the end defeat without rebelling. Her death in a small hospital in the Alps was overshadowed by the flames of the Reichstag, by the ruins of Berlin, and by the Nuremberg trials. But in her silence, in her resignation, and in her slow agony lies one of the darkest images of the fall of the Third Reich, the wife of Hitler's secretary fading away alone, far from the cameras, without children at her side, without a husband, without Reich, without future. Carin Göring, the saint of National Socialism. Long before the Reich reached its peak, the first wife of Hermann Göring had already become a myth. Carin, with her fragility and her incurable illness, died in 1931, but her shadow accompanied the Marshal throughout the war. She did not witness the destruction of Berlin nor the Nuremberg trials. Her fate remained trapped in the obsessive idealization of her husband, who built palaces and mausoleums to keep alive the image of the woman he had turned into his personal saint of National Socialism. Carin Axelina Hulda Fock was born in Stockholm in 1888 within an aristocratic Swedish family. Daughter of a noble military officer and a German mother, she grew up between two worlds, the discipline of the Swedish army and the elegance of European high society. From a young age, Carin stood out for her fragile beauty and a delicacy that contrasted with the physical vigor of her brothers. Raised in Catholicism, in an environment of cultural refinement, her life seemed destined for an aristocratic routine of receptions, travels, and advantageous marriage. She married in 1910 the Swedish officer Nils von Kantzow, with whom she had a son, Thomas. However, the marriage was not happy. Carin suffered from poor health, and the bond deteriorated amid tensions and silences. The course of her life changed radically in 1920 when she met Hermann Göring. He was then a young German war pilot, famous for having fought in the First World War in the legendary squadron of Manfred von Richthofen. After the war, Göring worked as a civilian pilot in Sweden. There, in a worldly environment of parties and military circles, they met. For Carin, it was an impact. That corpulent man, with overwhelming energy and an almost brutal temperament, became the axis of her life. For Göring, on the other hand, Carin represented purity, delicacy, the feminine ideal turned into personal myth. Both began a passionate and scandalous relationship since Carin was still married to Kantzow. Swedish society did not easily forgive the affair, but she left everything, husband, son, position, to join Hermann. The sacrifice was enormous. She lived in precariousness with him in the 1920s, when Göring began to link himself with Adolf Hitler's National Socialist movement. Carin, accustomed to aristocratic comfort, found herself sharing small rooms, traveling from one place to another, and supporting an ambitious man overwhelmed by his inner demons. Hermann called her his angel and displayed her as the symbol of his personal life. She supported him in his early adherence to the NSDAP and was present during the failed Munich Putsch in 1923 when Göring was wounded. It was precisely then that a stage of pain and deterioration began for both. Hermann was marked by morphine, to which he became addicted after surgeries, and Carin, with her fragile health, began to decline rapidly. Sick with tuberculosis, Carin became increasingly a frail figure. The illness advanced with cruel slowness, undermining her body and leaving her almost invalid. Her life turned into a pilgrimage between doctors, sanatoriums, and periods in Sweden, where she sought relief in nature and clean air. Despite her state, she remained faithful to Göring, accompanying him in his ascents within the party and in his first links with Hitler. Carin was for him much more than a wife. She became the symbol of his devotion to the movement, a sort of Aryan virgin who embodied the spiritual nobility that the Nazis sought to display. Tuberculosis finally consumed her on the 17th of October of 1931, when she was barely 42 years old. Her death was the most decisive event in the intimate life of Hermann Göring. It became obsession, myth, relic. Carin left behind an aura of martyr that he knew how to exploit until the last days of the Third Reich. He ordered the construction in Germany of a majestic residence called Carinhal, a palace in the middle of the Schorfheide forest which bore her name and which he conceived as a sanctuary of his love. On the walls and hallways, portraits of Carin hung like religious icons. In the main rooms, her personal objects were venerated like relics. Even a mausoleum was built to house her remains, transferred from Sweden. For Göring, Carinhal was not only his residence of power, but also a temple dedicated to the memory of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. During the Third Reich, Carin became a public symbol. In official receptions, in speeches, and in the images projected by propaganda, her memory was invoked as the example of the fidelity and sacrifice that National Socialism demanded. Göring spoke of her with tears, showed her photo to new amorous conquests, and even gave framed portraits of Carin as if they were relics of an intimate cult. His second wife, Emmy Sonnemann, could never completely displace that shadow. Even married to a new woman and father of a daughter, Göring continued to render cult to Carin's memory. It was a burden that Emmy bore with silent resignation. With the fall of the Reich in 1945, the myth of Carin became a tragic echo. When the Red Army advanced on Berlin and Göring took refuge in Bavaria, Carinhal was blown up by order of Göring himself so that it would not fall into enemy hands. Carin's mausoleum was destroyed, her relics scattered, and the sanctuary that had been conceived as an eternal testimony of love turned into ruins under the bombs. However, Carin's memory accompanied him until the end. Prisoner of the Allies, humiliated in Nuremberg, Göring continued to show the photo of his first wife, recounting with pathos the story of that fragile woman who had left everything for him. The last hours of Carin did not belong to the days of April of 1945, like Magda Goebbels, but to a decade earlier. She died in her bed, consumed by illness, without crashes or explosions, without suicide or escape. Her end was intimate, painful, and silent. And yet, her death weighed like a ghost in the corridors of Nazi power throughout the war. The cult of Carin became part of Göring's identity, and a projection of the image of female sacrifice that the Reich used to reinforce its propaganda. Her tomb, destroyed, was looted and moved several times until finally her remains rested in Sweden. But the true tomb of Carin was the obsessive memory of her husband, who carried her image as a trophy and a cross until his own last days in prison. In the basements of the Third Reich, when everything collapsed and Berlin burned, Carin was not physically there, but her shadow was still present. The dead wife had become a secular saint, the muse of a leader who never ceased to present her as his lost angel. While other Nazi leaders sank with their wives poisoned or pursued by cancer, the memory of Carin had already been in the realm of the dead for more than a decade. Her end was no less brutal, not because of the violence of her death, but because of the way in which her identity was turned into a political tool, torn from the intimate to become a collective myth. Emmy Göring, the Lady of the Theatre and the Fall of Splendor. Emmy Sonnemann was born in Hamburg in 1893 in the bosom of a well-off family thanks to the industrial prosperity of her father, owner of a chocolate factory. From a young age, she showed an inclination toward art, especially theatre, despite her father's resistance. Her mother, more sensitive, supported that vocation. She won a scholarship to study at a school of acting and began her career in regional theatres, performing characters of Goethe, Ibsen and Wilde. She quickly gained notoriety for her lofty beauty, her aristocratic features, and a clear voice that dominated the stage. In 1914, she married the actor Carl Köstlin, with whom she shared stages but not passion. The bond dissolved a few years later. The 1920s found her in Weimar, cradle of artistic modernism, where she lived with enthusiasm the world of theatre and cultural bohemia. It was there that she met Hermann Göring, at that time a war hero who was beginning to move in the circles of the NSDAP. At that time, Göring was still mourning the death of his first wife, Carin. Emmy met him widowed, devastated, surrounded by memories. Their first relationship was marked by the shadow of the deceased. He gave her a portrait of Carin as his first gift, showed her the sanctuary he had built in her memory, and made clear to her that her place in his life would never be completely hers. Emmy accepted that destiny with resignation. She would not compete with the dead saint, but she would become the official lady of the future Marshal. They married in 1935 in a sumptuous ceremony with Hitler as guest of honor. The marriage was a state event designed as a spectacle. Emmy assumed an immediate public role. From then on, she was treated as the First Lady of the Reich, even before Eva Braun or Magda Goebbels. Her theatrical elegance, her actress's bearing, and her proximity to luxury made her the feminine face of Nazi splendor. She dressed in silks, jewels, and furs, received ambassadors, headed charity committees, and attended operas in the company of Hitler. Her life unfolded among receptions, castles, and hunts in Carinhall, the palace residence that Göring had built as a monument to his power and to the memory of Carin. Emmy moved in that setting as if it were an extension of the theatrical stage, always in the foreground, always conscious of the gazes. Unlike Magda Goebbels, who projected motherhood, or Gerda Bormann, discreet and dim, Emmy represented lavishness. Her marriage gave her a daughter, Edda, in 1938, named thus in homage to Hitler, who was her godfather at baptism. Emmy was thus symbolically united to the innermost circle of the Führer. Motherhood, however, did not take away the shine of her social life. During the first years of war, she continued attending events, wearing tailored suits and displaying the wealth accumulated by Göring. She was the target of rumors, jealousy, and criticism, above all from other wives of hierarchs, who saw her as too vain and conscious of her position. The war, little by little, extinguished that radiance. As Germany sank on the Eastern Front and the Luftwaffe failed in its mission, Göring's power began to crumble. Emmy still received attention, but no longer with the same devotion. The bombings over Berlin destroyed the image of luxury she had cultivated, and the murmurs about corruption and the looting of works of art by Göring tarnished her role. Nevertheless, she continued presenting herself as an Iron Lady, sustaining the dignity of her symbolic position. When the Reich collapsed in 1945, Emmy was a direct witness of the fall of splendor. While Magda Goebbels descended into the Berlin bunker and poisoned her children, Emmy accompanied Göring in his last days of power. Together they took refuge in Bavaria, in Mautendorf Castle, belonging to the family of Göring. There they awaited the Allied armies, aware that the end was near. Göring, who dreamed of negotiating with the Americans, was arrested by order of Hitler, accused of treason. Emmy witnessed how the man who had been Marshal of the Reich was reduced to a humiliated prisoner. The last days of April and the first days of May were for Emmy a mixture of panic and resignation. She was with her young daughter, Edda, in an atmosphere of unbearable tension. The American troops surrounded the region and captured the family. Emmy, accustomed to silk dresses and opera halls, found herself searched by soldiers, stripped of her jewels, taken to common cells. She was interned in a prisoner camp in Augsburg. The testimonies of the time show her in tears, unable to accept the loss of everything that had constituted her identity. For her, defeat was not only the political ruin of the Reich, but the disappearance of the life of luxury that had defined her for a decade. The contrast was brutal. From hostess of receptions in Carin Hall, she passed to wearing a prisoner's uniform with her gaze fixed on the floor, trying to maintain an impossible dignity. There she faced interrogations, accusations, and public shame. She had not committed direct war crimes, but she was a symbol of looting and corruption, a passive accomplice of the regime she had sustained. She was sentenced in 1948 to 1 year of forced labor and to the confiscation of part of her goods, although her daughter was preserved from stigma. The post-war years were grey and silent. Emmy never again shone in theatres nor in official halls. She lived apart, caring for Edda, marked by the past. She died in 1973 in Munich, in the same city where the political career of her husband had begun and where the Reich had woven part of its destiny. The actress, who had once been First Lady of the Reich, ended her days in discretion, without riches nor honours, remembered only as the woman who accompanied Göring in his rise and who fell with him in the collapse of the Third Reich. In the last days of the war, Emmy had not chosen to die like Magda, nor had she slowly bled as Gerda. Her end was different. She survived to see the ruin and carry the stigma. She was witness to the downfall of her husband in Nuremberg, where Hermann committed suicide with cyanide before being hanged. She carried with her until the end the image of lost glory, of the days when she dressed in velvet to sit next to Hitler at the opera. Her tragedy was not violent death, but the life that followed, prolonged, grey and meaningless, under the unbearable weight of a past she could never erase. Ilse Hess, the widow of the prisoner of peace. Ilse Pröll was born in Hanover in 1900 in a middle-class family of means, marked by the patriotic spirit of Imperial Germany. From a young age, she showed a firm personality, more combative than that of other women of her environment. She studied at the university, a rare fact for women of her generation, and became interested in politics in turbulent times. The defeat of 1918, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, and the instability of the Weimar Republic awakened in her a strong resentment. That unrest drew her to National Socialism, when it was still a marginal and violent movement. It was in Munich where she met Rudolf Hess, a shy and obsessive young man, veteran of the Great War, who had found in Adolf Hitler a messianic figure. They met at the university and shared political concerns, discussions about geopolitics, and dreams of German greatness. The bond between them grew closer until it became marriage in 1927. Ilse found in Rudolf a rigid man, emotionally distant but completely devoted to a cause. She accepted that devotion and transformed it into her own faith. She would not be the wife of a husband, but the companion of a political crusader. Life with Rudolf Hess was a life of militancy. Ilse was not a passive woman. She wrote, expressed opinions, organized, and was one of the most fanatical wives of the intimate Nazi circle. While others cultivated luxury, Ilse cultivated ideology. She supported her husband in moments of doubt, took part in party ceremonies, and defended Hitler as a prophet. Unlike Emmy Göring, who enjoyed splendor, or Magda Goebbels, who represented motherhood, Ilse was the comrade who accompanied Rudolf in his radicalism. Her life took a turn in 1941, when Rudolf, without warning Hitler, undertook a secret flight to Scotland to try to negotiate peace with Great Britain. The news shook the Reich. Hitler's lieutenant had landed in enemy territory with the intention of offering an impossible agreement. For Hitler, it was treason. For Ilse, it was the supreme sacrifice. From that day, her existence was marked by the absence of her husband, prisoner first of the British and later of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Ilse became Rudolf's tireless defender. She visited him whenever she could, wrote letters, drafted manifestos, and sought international support to obtain his release. Her house was transformed into a center of pilgrimage for sympathizers, and she herself into a symbol of female sacrifice for the cause. She never doubted her husband. She considered him a misunderstood hero, a martyr who had risked everything to save Germany from destruction. That absolute faith sustained her for decades. At the end of the war in 1945, while Berlin sank under Soviet fire, Ilse lived the collapse from afar. She was not in the bunker. She did not share the final hours with Magda nor with Eva Braun. Her tragedy was different. Her husband survived, but as a prisoner, humiliated and condemned. For her, defeat was not a heroic suicide nor a desperate escape, but an endless wait. Rudolf was sentenced at Nuremberg to life imprisonment and confined in Spandau prison, sharing confinement with other leaders until one by one they died or were released. Ilse devoted the following decades of her life to an unceasing campaign for his freedom. She wrote articles, organized protests, sought support in far-right parties, and even appealed to foreign leaders. In the 1980s, already elderly, she wrote an introduction to a book by her son Wolf about the Hess case, where she insisted that her husband had been the victim of a conspiracy and that he had to be freed. Rudolf's figure had been transformed into an obsession. For Ilse, he was not only her husband, he was the embodiment of a betrayed mission. On the 17th of August of 1987, that mission was brutally broken. That day, Rudolf Hess, 93 years old, was found dead in the garden of Spandau. Officially, it was said that he had used an electric cable to hang himself. The British assured it was suicide. Ilse and her son Wolf never accepted it. They claimed that he had been murdered, that it was not possible for such a weakened old man to hang himself with such precision. The news was for Ilse a definitive blow. She had spent more than 40 years waiting for his return, and suddenly she had lost him for good. The reaction of Ilse was furious. She demanded autopsies, denounced the Allied authorities, accused the British of murder. She managed to have the body subjected to several more examinations, all coinciding with the official version, but her faith in the conspiracy did not break. For her, the death of Rudolf was further proof of the world plot against National Socialism. Her own life entered a state of absolute exhaustion. Already in her 80s, tired of struggling against walls of silence, she ended up in a residence in the early years of the 1990s. There, far from the splendor of the Reich, far even from the Spandau prison, she spent her last days in a silence marked by defeat. Ilse Hess did not die in the roar of bombs nor by poisoning her children in a basement, but her end was equally brutal. She survived to watch how the world she had loved disappeared, how her husband became a forgotten prisoner, and how her faith became ever more irrational. When she died in 1995, she did so as a broken woman who had reduced her existence to the wait for an imprisoned man and to the defense of a dead regime. She was, in many ways, the longest widow of the Third Reich, the one who could not let go, the one who never accepted the end, the one who turned her life into a mausoleum of fidelity and obsession. Lina Heydrich, the widow of the Butcher of Prague. Lina Mathilde von Osten was born in 1911 on the island of Fehmarn in the north of Germany, within a traditional family, with a father who was a teacher and a mother deeply religious. She grew up in an environment where discipline and order were fundamental values. From a young age, she showed a strong, determined character, even aggressive for the standards of the time. She dreamed of escaping the routine life of her small island and reaching a greater destiny. It was in 1930, at a dance in Kiel, where she met the man who would change her life, Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich, a naval officer recently demoted for a womanizing scandal, carried the humiliation of having been expelled from the Reichsmarine. Tall, blonde, with a cold gaze, he emanated a mixture of arrogance and vulnerability that fascinated Lina. She did not hesitate to support him. She convinced him to approach the National Socialist Party and opened the doors to the SS for him through a contact with Heinrich Himmler. It was, to a great extent, her drive that marked Heydrich's course. The marriage between them was celebrated in 1931, sealing not only a personal union, but also a political and social alliance that catapulted them to the top of the Reich. As wife of Reinhard Heydrich, Lina was an active part of his rise. She encouraged him at every step, justified him in every brutality, accompanied him at each rung of power. Unlike other women who remained in the shadows, Lina assumed an ideological role. She was fanatical about National Socialism, a convinced anti-Semite and loyal to Hitler with devotion. In her home in Berlin and later in Prague, she organized receptions for officers, cultivated strategic social relationships, and presented herself as the model of a German wife, firm, proud, and fertile. They had 4 children, raised under the same doctrine that she professed with fervor. Heydrich was named Protector of the Reich in Bohemia and Moravia in 1941, and his name became synonymous with terror. While he ruled Prague with an iron fist, persecuting, executing, and deporting thousands, Lina enjoyed a life of luxury in the residences confiscated from the Jews. She drove sports cars, rode in confiscated fields, organized dinners with officers. Her daily life was sustained by the pain of others, and she never showed remorse. For her, the power of her husband was the triumph of the mission she had encouraged from the beginning. But on the 27th of May of 1942, Lina's life changed irrevocably. That day, in Prague, Heydrich was attacked by members of the Czech resistance in Operation Anthropoid. A grenade exploded against his vehicle, gravely wounding him. For days, Lina kept vigil among doctors, officers, and priests, waiting for a miracle. The infection ended up winning, and on the 4th of June, Reinhard Heydrich died. He was 38 years old and one of the most feared men of the Third Reich. The news struck Lina with devastating intensity. Hitler himself attended the funeral and pronounced words of praise for the man of iron. The widow, barely 31 years old, became a symbol of fidelity and sacrifice. She was granted state honors, received pensions and properties, and was treated as a heroine of the Reich. Lina assumed that role with pride, never showing a tear in public. Behind the facade, however, had begun the long path of a widowhood that would accompany her until the end of her life. During the last years of war, Lina lived between Prague and Bavaria, raising her children and upholding the memory of her husband as a National Socialist martyr. The defeat of 1945 destroyed that pedestal. She was arrested by Allied forces, interrogated and put under suspicion for her fanaticism. Her life was reduced to judicial litigation and the struggle to preserve something of the properties she had received as compensation for Reinhard's death. In 1947, a denazification tribunal in Germany classified her as a major accomplice of the regime, but she managed to avoid long sentences. Her role as a mother and the lack of direct evidence of personal crimes allowed her to slowly reintegrate into civil life. The post-war years were bitter. Lina settled again on her native island of Fehmarn in the Baltic Sea, where she tried to lead a discreet life as owner of a tourist guest house. There she raised her children, always defended the memory of her husband, and never renounced her political faith. To those who visited her, she spoke with pride of the honor of Heydrich and justified his role in history. She published memoirs in 1976 titled Life with a Man of Iron, where she presented Reinhard as a tender husband and at the same time as a loyal servant of Germany, omitting the atrocities committed under his command. Her last years were witnesses to the international condemnation of the legacy of Nazism, but Lina never repented. In interviews, she denied the Holocaust, defended her husband's decisions, and accused the victors of having manipulated history. She died in 1985 in Fehmarn at 74 years old. She never stopped vindicating Reinhard Heydrich as a fallen hero and never abandoned the ideology she had embraced in her youth. The end of Lina Heydrich was not a violent death, but a long moral exile. She survived her husband by more than 4 decades, carrying the stigma of having been the wife of the butcher of Prague. Her tragedy was not in the loss of luxury nor in Allied persecution, but in the impossibility of letting go of memory. She turned her widowhood into a cause, her life into a monument to a murderer, and her death into the echo of an ideology that refused to disappear. Margarete Himmler, the forgotten wife of the Reichsführer. Margarete Boden was born in 1893 in a well-off family of doctors and merchants from northern Germany. From a young age, she was distinguished by her serious character and an almost severe discipline, a trait that would accompany her throughout her life. She studied nursing in her youth and came to work in hospitals during the First World War, where she developed a strong sense of order and obedience. She was not a frivolous woman nor socially prominent, rather reserved, strict and rigid. Her acquaintances described her as someone dry, without natural charm, but with a deep sense of duty. In 1927, already in her 30s and considered late to marry by the standards of her time, she met Heinrich Himmler, then a 26-year-old young man, a frustrated agronomist, radical nationalist, and rising member of the SS. The encounter was curious. Margarete was 7 years older, but he was fascinated by her spirit of order and her stability. They married that same year. For Heinrich, obsessed with discipline and racial purity, Margarete represented the ideal companion, serious, surly, and in accordance with his ideology. The marriage, however, was never a bond of passion. They had a daughter, Gudrun, in 1929, whom both adored and raised in a rigid, deeply indoctrinated environment. Margarete devoted herself to motherhood and to the home, while Heinrich immersed himself in building his political and military career. The couple quickly moved into a life apart. He resided in Berlin at the heart of the Nazi apparatus, and she in Gmünd in Bavaria in a stately house with gardens and servants. Margarete rarely appeared in public with her husband. Unlike Emmy Göring or Magda Goebbels, she was never a face of the regime. Her role was silent but not indifferent. Margarete shared Heinrich's ideological convictions. She participated in the National Socialist Women's League, organized collections for the Red Cross, and visited military hospitals. She applauded racial policies and encouraged her daughter Gudrun to idolize her father. There were no doubts or cracks in her. Anti-Semitism was a natural truth, Aryan supremacy, an unshakable faith. In letters and diaries, she revealed a deeply conformist mentality, convinced that personal sacrifice was at the service of the Reich. While Himmler rose to become Reichsführer SS, head of the Gestapo and architect of the final solution, Margarete lived isolated in Bavaria, managing properties, attending minor social events, and raising Gudrun as Princess of the Reich. The marriage, though official, grew more distant. Since 1938, Heinrich maintained a parallel relationship with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, with whom he had 2 children. Margarete knew it and accepted it in silence, like so many wives of leaders who had no voice before the machinery of power. When the war began to turn, Margarete remained in her Bavarian refuge, unconcerned with the military collapse. In 1944, she was still visiting hospitals, delivering gifts to wounded soldiers, and defending her husband's figure in letters. But defeat was approaching quickly. In April of 1945, while Berlin sank in flames and Hitler dictated his last orders in the bunker, Margarete was in Gmünd, taking care of Gudrun and waiting for news. The image of the Reichsführer, which for her was that of an honorable man, began to crack under the weight of catastrophe. The collapse arrived like a devastating tide. In May of 1945, Heinrich Himmler tried to negotiate with the Allies, but was rejected and arrested. He committed suicide with a cyanide capsule in Lüneburg on the 23rd of May. Margarete received the news in Bavaria, surrounded by silence and rumors. Her world, built around obedience and devotion, crumbled in an instant. Gudrun, barely a teenager, sank into despair. Mother and daughter were detained by the Americans. The following days were a continuous humiliation. The woman who had lived in luxurious houses and surrounded by servants was searched, interrogated, treated as an accomplice. She was interned in a prisoner camp along with Gudrun and subjected to long denazification sessions. Unlike Emmy Göring, who had enjoyed splendor, Margarete could not wield glamour nor contacts. She was an invisible wife without shine. but inseparable from the man who had embodied the terror of the Reich. In the immediate years after the war, Margarete lived in marginalization. Her properties were taken away, she was prohibited from holding public positions, and she depended on the help of relatives and the loyalty of her daughter. Gudrun, fanatical like her mother, continued to defend Himmler's memory until her death. Both women became shadows, living in small towns surrounded by mistrust. Margarete died in 1967, almost forgotten, without honors, without wealth, without recognition. The end of Margarete Himmler was grey and silent, as her public life had been. She did not die by poisoning her children like Magda, nor in the agony of a hospital like Gerda Bormann. She died as she lived, in the background, faithful until the end to the ideology she had embraced. Her tragedy was not violent death, but life in the shadows, condemned to anonymity and to the stigma of being the wife of the Reichsführer. While other wives had shone in the salons of power, she faded into the twilight of the post-war, accompanied only by a daughter who never ceased to venerate her father. Annelies von Ribbentrop, the wife of the Minister of Defeat. Annelies Henkel was born in 1896 in Wiesbaden, in the heart of a family marked by industrial prosperity. Her father, Otto Henkel, was the magnate of the most important champagne firm in Germany, Henkel Trocken. The family's wealth gave Annelies a distinguished education, with access to elite schools, music lessons, and exclusive social circles. She grew up surrounded by comforts, servants, parties, and a world where life seemed destined to perpetuate fortune and the family name. Unlike other future wives of Nazi hierarchs, she was not the daughter of soldiers nor officials, but of businessmen, and her mentality was always steeped in the notion of social status and economic power. Her marriage to Joachim von Ribbentrop in 1920 surprised many. He was then a young wine merchant without noble titles, with excessive ambitions but without his own fortune. For the Henkels, he was a commoner seeking to climb through her. But Annelies saw in Joachim something different. A man capable of imposing his will and with a thirst for advancement as great as hers. They married in Wiesbaden and soon had 5 children. With her dowry and her father's help, Ribbentrop was able to build his own wine and champagne company, consolidating the beginning of the career that would take him to the highest circles of power. The union with Annelies was decisive. She was not a decorative wife. She actively participated in business, organized receptions, opened doors in high society, and consolidated the image of a powerful couple. Through her contacts in the business and aristocratic world, Ribbentrop began presenting himself in diplomatic salons where, little by little, he began to stand out. The marriage became a social machine, and Annelies learned to move in luxury environments with the same naturalness as in her childhood home. When Joachim joined the NSDAP in 1932, Annelies supported him enthusiastically. Her fortune and contacts facilitated the approach to Hitler's circle. The Führer himself visited the Ribbentrop's house in Berlin, enjoyed dinners organized by Annelies, and was impressed by the display of luxury. In those years, the wife of the future minister was already known for her haughty character and her contempt toward others. Witnesses of the time described her as an arrogant, cold woman, convinced of her superiority. That arrogance was reflected in gestures as simple as refusing to greet those she considered inferior or humiliating guests at private receptions. Her relationship with other wives of hierarchs was tense. Emmy Göring, accustomed to shining in receptions, considered her unbearable. Magda Goebbels, symbol of the Aryan mother, kept her distance. Annelies cultivated silent enmities because she did not seek sympathies. She sought power. In the social apparatus of the Third Reich, she projected herself as the wife of the diplomat par excellence, refined and with an air of pretended nobility that Joachim had acquired by purchasing the von that preceded his surname. When Ribbentrop was named ambassador in London in 1936, Annelies accompanied him to England and deployed her entire arsenal of ambitions. Installed in the German embassy residence at Carlton House Terrace, She organized lavish receptions, dinners with her family's champagne, and evenings where aristocrats, businessmen, and British politicians mingled. For Annelies, London was a stage on which to play the role of great European lady. However, her arrogance and disdain for the English soon became notorious. Her lack of social tact, added to the diplomatic clumsiness of her husband, contributed to the failure of the mission in London. In 1938, with Ribbentrop's rise to Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annelies settled in Berlin as part of the Reich elite. She enjoyed privileges, travel, and mansions. She was portrayed at official banquets wearing expensive dresses, pearl necklaces, and the distant air of one who feels untouchable. While her husband negotiated the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact with Stalin or the alliances with Italy and Japan, she dedicated herself to reinforcing her image as a grand lady without worrying about the shadows spreading over Europe. During the war, Annelies maintained a relatively low profile in public life but did not abandon her ostentatious lifestyle. Her children grew up in an environment of privileges, protected from the bombings and hunger that the German population suffered. She, however, showed no compassion. She believed in the Reich's mission and felt herself part of the elite destined to govern. Her loyalty to Joachim was absolute, although he was increasingly discredited in the Nazi circle. Hitler tolerated him but considered him a clumsy and uncharismatic bureaucrat. The fall of the Reich in 1945 swept everything away. When the Soviet and American armies met at the Elbe, the Ribbentrops were in Berlin, watching the collapse of the world they had built. Joachim tried to take refuge in the north, but was captured by the Allies in Hamburg. Annelies was left in a desperate situation. From champagne banquets, she passed to the anguish of interrogations. Her properties were confiscated, her surname turned into a synonym of defeat. The Nuremberg trial was for her a prolonged torment. Sitting in the courtroom, she listened as Joachim was accused of war crimes, conspiracy, and crimes against peace. She saw him turned into a pathetic figure, defending his innocence with empty speeches. For Annelies, that was not justice, it was humiliation. On the 16th of October of 1946, Joachim von Ribbentrop was hanged after pronouncing his last words. "God protect Germany! May God have mercy on my soul! My last hope is that Germany maintain unity and realize that love is everything." Annelies was left the widow of a war criminal without fortune, with 5 children in her care and a surname marked forever. The Allies confiscated her assets, and denazification classified her as an accomplice. She lived for years in poverty, depending on the help of relatives and minor jobs. From receptions in London and Berlin, she passed to the darkness of a modest apartment, trying to survive with the bare minimum. Her tragedy was different from that of Magda Goebbels, who died with her children in the bunker, or that of Gerda Bormann, who agonized from cancer in a hospital. Annelies survived to see how her husband's surname was etched in history as a symbol of the diplomacy of disaster. She never renounced Joachim, never condemned him. She died in 1973 in West Germany, without honors, without wealth, without applause. Only a shadow remained of the grand lady who had raised champagne glasses in Carlton House Terrace and in the Wilhelmstrasse. The end of Annelies von Ribbentrop was silent, but laden with unbearable weight. She survived almost 3 decades after the fall of the Reich, widow of a despised man, condemned to live in poverty after having known absolute luxury. The woman who had dreamed of being the grand lady of the Reich ended her days alone, forgotten, like a spectre carrying the stigma of a cursed surname. Henriette von Schirach, the wife who broke the silence. Henriette Hoffmann was born in 1913 in Munich, within a family closely linked to Hitler's inner circle. Her father, Heinrich Hoffmann, was the official photographer of the Führer, the man who shaped Hitler's public image through thousands of portraits that flooded calendars, postcards, and propaganda. From childhood, Henriette grew up surrounded by uniforms, speeches, and visits from high-ranking Nazis at the family home. She was in many ways a daughter of the regime even before the regime existed. Through her father, she met Hitler in adolescence. The Führer became a family figure, almost paternal to young Henriette. Hitler often came to her house, dined with the Hoffmanns, walked with them, and she saw him as a constant and close presence. In her later memoirs, Henriette would recall those visits with tenderness, describing Hitler as a kind man in private dealings, someone who spoke to her about art and animals and not about the hatred he spat in rallies. That double image of Hitler, intimate and political, would mark her entire life. In 1932, she married Baldur von Schirach, then a young man rising within the NSDAP, a devoted fanatic of Hitler and a brilliant organizer. He would soon become Reichsjugendführer, the leader of the Hitler Youth. The marriage united two symbolic lineages, the daughter of the Führer's photographer and the head of the Reich's Youth. For Henriette, the wedding was a ceremony of consecration within the movement. Hitler attended as guest of honor, and photos of the young couple appeared in magazines and newspapers as the perfect example of the Aryan marriage. The early years were of splendor. Baldur, charismatic and dynamic, organized massive parades of uniformed youths that filled entire squares, while Henriette appeared at his side as the exemplary wife. Her discreet beauty, her timid smile, and her elegant bearing completed the image of the perfect National Socialist family. Soon they had children and settled in a luxurious residence in Berlin, where Henriette organized receptions for officials, artists, and personalities. She was seen as a cultured woman, refined, interested in literature and music, and her home became a salon where politics and culture were equally discussed. But the war transformed the life of the Schirachs. In 1940, Baldur was appointed Gauleiter of Vienna, absolute ruler of the occupied city. There he faced the task of executing the deportation policies of the Jews. Under his administration, tens of thousands of Jewish families were expelled and sent eastward to ghettos and extermination camps. While Baldur signed orders, Henriette witnessed scenes that began to shatter her conviction. Life in Vienna confronted her with a brutal reality that she could no longer ignore. In 1943, during an official visit to the Netherlands, she witnessed the boarding of Jewish children onto a train. That image marked her deeply. Later, in a private meeting at the Berghof, Hitler's residence in the Bavarian Alps, Henriette dared to comment on what she had seen. In a low voice at the table, she said, "What we are doing with the Jews is inhuman." The words fell like a bomb. Silence took over the hall. Hitler, furious, stood up, looked at her with glacial anger, and said that he would never again allow that subject to be spoken of in his presence. That moment marked her fall from grace. Henriette, who until then had been part of the Führer's intimate circle, was branded a traitor. Hitler himself ordered that neither she nor her husband ever be invited to his residence again. Although Baldur remained in his post in Vienna until the end of the war, the stigma of Henriette's words accompanied him. The woman who had grown up in the shadow of the Führer and who had venerated him as a father had dared to challenge him with a single phrase. She was not a resistance fighter. She did not take up arms. She did not denounce publicly. But within the heart of the regime, a whisper was enough to be considered an enemy. In 1945, with the German defeat, Henriette fled Vienna with her children. The luxury of her residence crumbled in a matter of days. Soviet soldiers advanced, looting and devastating, and she sought refuge in Bavaria. There she was arrested by the Americans and subjected to interrogations. Her surname condemned her. Schirach was on the list of war criminals. Baldur was arrested and taken to Nuremberg, where he would be tried for crimes against humanity. Henriette then faced the brutal transition from splendor to ruin. From receiving guests in silk dresses and jewels, she passed to wearing simple clothes in improvised cells. Her children, accustomed to servants and gardens, suffered hunger and fear. She was subjected to denazification, where her statement about the Jews resurfaced. Some wanted to see her as a repentant witness, others accused her of hypocrisy. She always maintained that her words had been spontaneous, a human gesture in the face of horror, but she never completely broke with the ideology that had sustained her life. The fate of Baldur sealed hers. In Nuremberg, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for crimes against humanity. The image of Henriette attending the trial, seeing her husband in the dock, was devastating. For 2 decades, she visited him in Spandau prison, bringing food, letters, and the company of their children. She was faithful, but not unconditional. Her relationship with Baldur became distant, marked by guilt and recrimination. In 1960, when he was still imprisoned, she decided to divorce him, convinced that they no longer shared anything. After the divorce, Henriette lived discreetly in Munich, writing memoirs where she recounted her life alongside Hitler and the leaders of the Reich. In those texts, she sought to redeem herself, presenting herself as a naive woman trapped in a machinery from which she could not escape. However, critics accused her of minimizing her role, of hiding her youthful fanaticism, and of using the anecdote of 1943 as an excuse to cleanse her image. She died in 1992 at 79 years of age in relative anonymity. Her life had begun in the intimate closeness of the Führer and ended in a modest apartment as the divorced widow of a war criminal. Her tragedy was not dying by poisoning her children nor in the agony of cancer, but living the rest of her existence with the mark of having been too close to power and of having broken the silence too late. Henriette von Schirach was the wife who, in the midst of a world of fanaticism, dared to utter a forbidden phrase. She did not save anyone, she did not stop the trains, she did not prevent the catastrophe. But at the Berghof table, surrounded by leaders, she dared to say what others kept quiet, and that gesture, minimal but explosive, condemned her to moral exile in life.